Before we begin this sermon, one of them you may not like, the other one I think you'll like. But this is the announcements. Number one, I misspoke last Sunday. And I know when a preacher says that or a politician says that, you're like, is that a fancy way of saying you lied? I did lie, but I didn't mean to lie. Okay, I thought we only had 3 weeks left in Hebrews. We've actually got 4 weeks left in Hebrews because we split chapter 11 up into 2 parts, and we're going to do the second part today. I also split chapter 12 up into 2 parts, and I don't remember why, but we'll figure it out next week. And so we're going all the way to Advent with this series, and the Advent is not far, as you heard Ebony talk about. The last Sunday of this month is actually the beginning of Advent, and we've got a cool, I say cool, I don't know if that's still the right thing to say. That's what we used to say when I was a kid, but we got a cool series that my son actually came up with. So it was his idea, and I think you'll really enjoy it. But the second announcement is you're not going to get the same sermon as the first service. And I think you'll like this announcement. The first service went about 10 minutes too long. So I'm cutting that 10 minutes so that you can get out in a reasonable fashion, because technically it's 12:40 right now, and we're all hungry. So you're not going to hear this illustration. You'll just have to forever wonder, what was he going to say about the Civil War? Because we're going right to Hebrews. So we're in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. If it's your first time at Murray Hills, we've been in a super long study of the book of Hebrews. We've been here since August. And quick summary, Jesus is greater and the new covenant is better. That's it. Like, really? It took you 13 weeks to say that? It took me 13 weeks to reach that conclusion. Jesus is better, the new covenant is better. Jesus is greater, the new covenant is better. And the new covenant is better because Jesus is greater. So that's the whole thing we've been looking at in Hebrews. And Hebrews chapter 11 is what's known as the Hall of Fame of Faith. And what it is, the word faith is mentioned 24 times in 40 verses. And so Hebrews chapter 10 ends with an invitation. Let us draw near to God with the full assurance faith brings. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess, because he who promised is faithful. And don't give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage one another all the more as you see the day approaching. Like, that's the invitation of Hebrews chapter 10. And the original recipients would have thought, yeah, but how do we do that? And he said, you do that through faith. So faith is the assurance of what we can't see and the confidence in what we hope for. So you do that through faith. And then he started giving all of these examples of faith. So by faith, and he mentions Abel, and by faith Enoch, and by faith Noah, and by faith Abraham, and by faith Sarah. And so he just starts giving all these examples of faith. And it's a great use of the Old Testament, because what he's telling them is you should emulate their faith. You shouldn't emulate their practices, because their practices have changed. We don't approach God in the same way that they approached God. We don't use the priestly system. We don't use temple worship. We don't keep the Sabbath. We don't do all these kind of Old Testament practices. There's a new covenant. Jesus has established a new way for us to approach God. And so we copy their faith. We don't copy the old systems that they used to have. But we're going to start in verse 17, and we're just going to work through the end of the chapter. All right, and what we're doing is trying to build through these stories, because a lot of us grew up with these stories, and a lot of us didn't grow up with these stories. And so when you read this stuff in Hebrews chapter 11, you go, what is he talking about? And so I'm going to try to fill in some blanks as we go through it. So the first part here's just these 3 verses, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. I can't talk this morning. By faith, Abraham, so we're going to revisit Abraham briefly. When God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, he who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the death. Now, this story is found in Genesis chapter 22. You probably have time to read it. If you've never read it before, you got your Bible with you, you can flip back to Genesis 22 and read it while I'm talking. It is, in my opinion, one of the most disturbing stories in the Old Testament, because God has made this promise to Abraham that through his offspring many nations will come. Your offspring will be like the stars of the sky. And there was a long fulfillment of that promise, but it was finally fulfilled through Isaac. And then a decade or so later, God tells Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son as a burnt offering. I mean, it's every time I read the story in Genesis chapter 22, it's makes me uncomfortable to read it, because the writer of Genesis doesn't go in, because I'm wanting to know, what is Abraham thinking during this time? What's going on? What's he feeling? You know, what is happening with Abraham? The writer of Genesis just kind of matter-of-factly says that God asked Abraham to do this, and the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded up his donkey, and took his son and went to obey the Lord. And it's like, whoa, I mean, this is, what in the world is going on? And the end of the story, there's an angel of the Lord that appears, and Isaac is saved at the last minute, and then there's this long section where they praises the faithfulness of Abraham. Hebrews chapter 11 actually puts a little more context around the story. So when you read chapter 11, you go, oh, okay, that's because Hebrews 11 kind of explains that Abraham was reasoning that God could raise the dead. So maybe that's some of what he's thinking, you know, and in a manner he did receive Isaac back from the death. But the other thing I think that helps make sense of it is that the way we tell history in kind of modern Western terms is different than the way Hebrew history worked. So when you read your Old Testaments and you read this history, like in Genesis and Exodus, when we read it as modern Western Americans, we're concerned with chronology and the timeline of events and what are the specific facts that happened and how did this happen and what was this person thinking and how were they feeling, all those questions that I've got when I come to the text. Their main concern was, what are the theological facts? What is this story trying to tell us about God, or trying to tell us about faithfulness to God? And if you read Genesis 22 in that lens, it makes sense, because over and over the writer of Genesis says, it was his one and only son. It was his one and only son. It was his one and only son. God is asking Abraham to do something incredibly difficult and should bother us and disturb us a little bit, because he's asking him to sacrifice his one and only son. The writer of Hebrews makes that point too. Like, he wants you to know that this is his only son, one and only son, and this is through whom the promise will be fulfilled. And so there's an obvious foreshadowing in this story. The testing of Abraham's faith is obviously foreshadowing what God is going to do through Jesus through the cross. He's going to sacrifice his one and only son. And so this is all pointing us towards Jesus. And Abraham's praised for his faithfulness here because he obeyed God even when it didn't make sense. And one of the things you'll see that the writer of Hebrews does as we go through this chapter is he tells you the definition of faith in verse 1, and then he keeps building on that definition. And we saw some of that last week. But one part of faith is obeying God even when it doesn't make sense. You know, it doesn't make, I don't understand why God is asking me to do this. I don't understand why God is asking me to be obedient in this area, but I'm going to obey him even when it doesn't make sense to me to obey him. And I think the large reason that story is in the Bible is just to point us to Jesus. And we'll come back to that here in just a minute. So then, verse 19 goes into verse 20, and there's three more people mentioned. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed Esau, Joseph's sons, and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. And by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Those stories in those three verses are told in Genesis chapter 23 through 50. There's a lot of history covered right there. And what it is, it's each successive generation of Abraham. And if you'll catch it, this is all at the end of their lives that it references their faith. And I think one of the things the writer's trying to tell us is that Abraham's faithfulness was not just within his generation. It extended down to his son. It extended down to his grandson. It extended down to his great-grandson. So Abraham's faithfulness went through generation after generation. And you'll hear a lot of times preachers talk about like how sin does that. Like you hear the old generational curses thing. We fail to talk about how faithfulness can endure generation after generation after generation. That's probably some of your story. That is certainly my story. I'll show you a picture here real quick. Have you ever met that man? No, I haven't either. Although he's my great-granddaddy. But I never met him. His name's H.N. Man. He went by Papa Man. He was a farmer and he was a preacher. He was a man of faith. That's pretty much what I know of him. He was a man of faith. But I know that his faithfulness was passed down to his children. And then their faithfulness was passed down to their children. Their faithfulness was passed down to their children. And then suddenly, here I sit on this stage being influenced by, in part, I'm a Christian in part, because of his faithfulness. His faithfulness endured generation after generation after generation after generation. And so think about it from this perspective. There are people that we will never get to meet who may be impacted by our faithfulness, by our decision. Like, I've made the decision that I want my family to be in church. And it's tough, and it's hard to get my family in church, and they don't always want to go. I don't always want to go. But I'm making a decision that I want to do this, and you could be changing your family tree by doing that. I mean, you could be changing generations that long after you're gone, generations may still be serving God because you made the decision to serve God. I mean, that's a powerful thing to think about. Or like, I made the decision to get sober. And it changes your family tree. One of the things, I don't want to steal all the thunder because I want your daughter to give her testimony at some point, Ricky, but one of the things at the Hope Center Gala I thought was, you're changing your family tree. Your daughter has a different father. And that's going to change her experience with faith, and that's going to change her kids' experience with faith, and her kids' experience with faith. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing here in Hebrews. He's kind of saying that this Abraham's faithfulness went generation after generation. It is a long obedience that we are trying to follow here. And that gets us to Exodus. All right? Exodus is, we get into the story of Moses. So by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. You remember that story about the mother hid him in the basket and put him in the Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter found him and adopted him. So this is an example of faith. But what was the example of faith? Because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover in the application of the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Now, there's a lot here, and we won't be able to dig into all of it, but there's a lot there because the story of Moses takes up pretty much the first half of the book of Exodus. But I want to go back to his parents' faith for just a minute. So faith, Abraham is an example of how faith means obeying God even when it doesn't make sense. The parents of Moses is an example of how faith can also be disobeying the civil authorities when it doesn't align with God's authority. I mean, they were not afraid of the king's edict. I mean, that's part of it. She's being praised for her civil disobedience, if you will. And that's a story that goes forward into the New Testament. Of course, Peter and John are standing before the Sanhedrin, and they said, we must obey God rather than man. And there's all sorts of examples throughout American history of where people have dissented against laws made by man because they were trying to follow the laws made by God. We call that civil disobedience. Of course, it fueled the civil rights movement. I happen to be reading a book about all of it right now. This is a book, halfway through this book right now, called Dissent, The History of an American Idea. And it basically takes 1776 and brings us forward to today and says how in every generation there were people who dissented. There were people who said, wait a minute, this ain't right. Wait a minute, what are we doing? Wait a minute, and they spoke up for justice. And many of them, this is what's amazing, this is not a Christian book. This is just an American history book. So many of them were fueled by their faith. It was their faith that motivated them to do something difficult, like obey God rather than man. One of the stories, the story I read this week as I'm writing this sermon, and I read this stuff about Moses, and I was like, oh, that's her story. One of the stories is this lady who's a devout Quaker. And she firmly believes in equality for all people. She lived in the early 1800s, late 1800s. Firmly believed in equality for all people. She was a staunch abolitionist, and she was an abolitionist because of her faith. But then after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, she shifted her focus to another disenfranchised group that she was a part of. And the 15th Amendment was passed, which gave the right of everyone to vote, except for one group, the other half of Americans. One gender didn't have that opportunity. And so this really bothered her. And so it was illegal for a woman to vote. And she went, when the next election, she went to the polls and she tried to place her vote. And she was arrested and she was fined, and they were going to throw her in jail unless she paid a $100 bail. And she told the judge, I'm not going to pay the $100. I want you to throw me in jail so that this story will get out. And the judge refused to do it. But she did eventually get what she was fighting for. Her name's Susan B. Anthony. She's on one of our coins. And Susan B. Anthony was motivated by her faith. It was her faith that, the scriptures teach equality for all, so she was willing to fight for equality for all, and she was not afraid of the king's edict, or in this case, the government's edict. She was not afraid to disobey the civil authorities. Now, the interesting thing about that, talk about my Papa man, she never saw what she fought for come to fruition. She died before women's suffrage passed. So she never got to see the thing she was fighting for, she never got to see. And that's going to be a story that will come back up here in Hebrews chapter 11 again as well. So we'll get there in just a minute. Moses was not afraid of the king's edict as well. It says that he left Egypt not fearing the king's anger. And the thing that Moses is praised for his faith is not, like obedience or disobedience. Moses is praised because he was willing to deny himself. So he is the adopted son of the Pharaoh's daughter. He's got all the pleasure he wants. He's got all the wealth he wants. He's got all the power he wants. But he chose to associate with his own people and the mistreatment that they were taking, and he chose to advocate for his own people. And he could have just lived in the life of luxury. He could have just, continued to live in the Pharaoh's house and said, I know that what's happening to my people is unjust, but it's not affecting me. If it's not affecting me, then what difference does it make? I mean, that's unfortunately the attitude a lot of us have. If it's not affecting me, I'm good. But Moses chose to identify with those who were being affected. He chose to identify with those vulnerable people. And he denied himself. And that Jesus talked about, one of the aspects of being a disciple of his is to deny yourself. Take up your cross, come after me, deny yourself. And Moses was actually motivated by some of this. Look at it, verse 26. I don't know if you caught this when I read it the first time I read it, but I'm going to read it again and see if there's anything weird about this verse. He, talking about Moses regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. So what motivated Moses to give up the treasures of Egypt? You see anything weird in that verse? You go, wait a minute. How did Christ motivate Moses to give up the treasures of Egypt? Because Christ wasn't here yet. Christ wasn't even born. How is it possible that Moses was doing this for the sake of Christ? And here's the point of it. The Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, there's a thread of foreshadowing and pointing ahead. So Abraham's story foreshadows and points ahead to the new covenant that's going to be established and the sacrifice that's going to be made by Jesus to establish that covenant. Moses' story is pointing ahead to the ultimate deliverer. Moses is a story of deliverance. He delivers people from slavery in Egypt, but he's pointing ahead to an ultimate deliverer who will deliver people from the slavery of their sin, and that's the Messiah. So even he didn't identify him as Jesus the Christ yet, but he is looking forward to a Messiah who will deliver God's people. And so Moses is even foreshadowing this as well. Here's the last three I'll look at with you. Verse 29 through 31. Says, by faith. Now, Moses' faith, Abraham's faith impacted successive generations and really an entire people group. Moses' faith did the same thing, even though he didn't see the promised land either. But Moses' faith impacted an entire people group because it says, by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And this is just the example, kind of going back to Abraham. Faith is sometimes doing what doesn't make sense or being obedient, or maybe I should put it this way. It's trusting God even when it doesn't make sense, because sometimes that's all you got. Sometimes that's all you do. And none of these make sense if you think about it. The Israelites standing before the Red Sea and the Egyptian army behind them, and they're going, what do you want us to do, God? You want us to wade into the sea and drown? What do you think is going to happen? You think the sea's going to part? It might. Or, what do you want us to do? I mean, Jericho's the most fortified city in Canaan. You want us to just to march around it and blow our trumpets? You think it's going to fall just because we march around it? It might. I mean, this is the nature of faith. I mean, sometimes the impossible happens, and we don't exactly know what's happening in the moment. Just like when they're marching around the walls of Jericho, they don't know exactly what's going on in the moment. The Israelites don't know exactly. They're scared. As they stand before the Red Sea, they're scared for good reason. They don't know exactly how God's going to deliver them. I'm guessing Abraham was scared when he took his son Isaac up to sacrifice. Because he don't know how God's going to deliver him. He thinks God's going to deliver him somehow, but he doesn't know how God's going to deliver him. And all he can do in the moment is trust. All Moses could do in the moment is trust. And sometimes that's all we can do in the moment. All we can do is trust. I'll give you a quick example of that. It's another flying story, so y'all just gotta deal with it. But this summer, we went to Maine, and we flew through Charlotte. So we took off from Charlotte, and we're flying up to Maine. And I don't love to fly. I've talked about this, primarily because I'm not in control, and I don't always understand what's happening. I don't know how those things fly. It makes no sense to me how those big metal tubes fly. And so when you hear noises as you're flying, I don't always know what they mean. And the little ding, I don't know if that means the stewardess is coming or we're crashing. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's like an emergency signal or it's you can stop smoking now, which you can't smoke anyway. But I don't know what any of that stuff means. And so in the moment when I'm flying, all I can do is trust. That's it. I'm not flying the plane. I have no control over what happens. I have no control over the mechanics. We can't pull over if there's a problem. It's just we're flying. And all I can do is trust. But sometimes that gets tested a little bit. So we're 30 minutes into this flight, and the pilot comes on. Everything's fine. It's smooth. We're, 25,000 feet in the air. They're starting to get the drinks ready. Pilot comes on and says, "There's nothing wrong with the plane." Now, you don't ever want to hear the pilot start with that because you're like, what's coming? But what's after the but? And there's nothing wrong with the plane. The controls are working fine. I do have control of the plane. The engines are working fine. We're being propelled just fine. But something's not working in the cockpit, and I don't have any air. So the cockpit has gotten unbearably hot. So it's about 120 degrees in the cockpit, and it's been this way for the last 30 minutes. And I was hoping we could kind of tough it out, but I can't. I'm going to have to return to Charlotte, but everything's fine. I'm going to have to return to Charlotte. And I just took it at face value, and I said, well, all right, we're okay. Everything's fine. Pilot just said everything's fine. The lady in front of me turned to her husband and said, if everything's fine, why are we going back to Charlotte? And I was like, she's right. And then she goes, it's not fine. The cockpit's not working. If the cockpit's not working, then what else is not working in the plane? What's causing that air not to work that might cause that engine not to work? And I was just like, okay, lady, you got to stop right now. Because the more she talked to her husband, I was like, she's making 100%. So my anxiety went from here to here, because boom, all of a sudden, now we're turning around flying. And so it took me a while, but I'm just kind of trying to calm down. And what can I do in that moment? I cannot fly that plane. I cannot even tell them how to fly the plane. I don't even understand how the plane is flying. The only thing I can do is trust God in that moment. That's it. That's all I can do is trust God. And so I'm, all right, I got 30 minutes to pray. So we'll pray. So we turn around, we're headed back. We get 10 minutes outside of Charlotte, and the pilot comes back on. And he says, you should not be alarmed about anything you see on the runway, but we've got a little bit too much fuel because we were planning on burning all of that on our way up to Maine, but we're going to have a heavy landing because we got too much fuel. So there's going to be fire trucks on the runway. We're going to do an emergency landing. There's going to be fire trucks on the runway, and then after we land, we got to sit for 30 minutes just to make sure that nothing ignites. Okay. So now it's through the roof, now it's just, it went from everything's fine to it's through the roof. And we do land, Everything is fine. It's a normal landing. There are fire trucks. We do sit there for 30 minutes. Nothing catches on fire. I'm here, so guess what? God answered our prayers. God answered my prayers. God answered my prayers. We made it safely. And kind of the funny thing was after we landed, I had not been talking to the guy beside me. There's a guy beside me. My son was we sit opposite of each other. My son was on the aisle seat. I was in the window, and there was a guy in the middle. And he's an older gentleman. And when we landed, I looked at him like, okay. And he pulled out his necklace, and he had a cross. And he goes, I've been praying, brother. and I had a cross. I had a wooden cross in my pocket, and I pulled it out, and I said, me too. And so we had a great conversation about faith all the way to, he was a retired military. We had a great conversation about faith all the way to Maine once we took back off. But the reason I tell that story is sometimes in the moment, like that's where you may be right now. Whatever's going on with your life, you may be in a situation where the plane has taken off. You have enrolled in the program, the plane's taken off, whatever it is. Like it's going and it's flying. And I don't know how it's still staying in the air, and I don't know exactly where I'm headed, and I don't know what direction this thing is going, and there may even be alarms along the way that tells you everything's not fine. It may be a bumpy flight, but it's going, and all you can do in that moment is trust. That's all you can do in the moment is trust. And you know what we call that? Because you can't see the future. You don't see the future. You don't know exactly how this is going to play out. You don't know exactly what God is up to. Now, in hindsight, you'll be able to look back and go, oh, once the plane landed, I could go back and say, oh, the pilot was right. Everything was okay. I didn't trust him for 30 minutes. I didn't believe him for 30 minutes. But he was right. Everything was okay. I just had to sit back in my seat and trust that God was in control. And we call that faith, confidence in what we hope for, and assurance in what we cannot see. Now, let me read this last part of the chapter. I'm going to quit. I promise. I don't have this on the screen. I just want to read you this because I love the way he ends this. This is the way he ends it. He says, and what more shall we say? So he gives all these examples. Faith, 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 faith. These people that trusted God in the moment. And what more shall we say? I don't even have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength. I mean, he just, like the writer of Hebrews starts preaching at the end of this chapter and just starts giving all these examples like, look what God has done through these people. Look what God's done through these faithful men and women. Women received back their dead. They were raised to life again. There were others who were torturers, refusing to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. He's just giving all these examples, but look at the last two sentences. He says, these were all commended for their faith. Talking about all the people in Hebrews chapter 11. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. As he's talking about old and new covenant right there. Like God, look at these people. They were faithful all throughout that covenant. But none of them received what God had planned and what God had promised. Because he had planned something better, a new covenant established through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, a new resurrection, a new heavens, a new earth, so that all of us together, Moses and all of us, will receive what has been promised. Therefore, this is the very next sentence, therefore, this is how you ought to live. And Ebony's going to explain that to us next week. It's chapter 12, verse 1. That's where we'll pick up next week. Let me pray for us. Father, I'm thankful for the Hall of Fame of Faith that we've come to call that chapter in Hebrews. And I'm thankful for the examples of these men and women who remained faithful to you even when it didn't make sense, who remained faithful to you even when it cost them something. That, it cost them denial of their self, or in some cases it cost them their freedom. We're thankful for the generations after them that have done the same thing. That generation after generation after generation, there have been people who have remained faithful to you, and we're sitting in this room in part because somebody down the road told us about you, and somebody around told us about Jesus, and that has endured for generation after generation. And we thank you for that. We thank you for your son, Jesus. We thank you for the new and better promises that he has in store for us. And it's in his name we pray these things. Amen. Last thing I'm going to mention is our offering. Where is it? See, if you're looking at your clocks right now, you're like, man, I'm glad you cut that other 10 minutes because I don't know where you're going to put it. I don't either. I don't know how that happened. But you can give electronically according to these ways. I sent an email and social media about our church is kind of stepping up. And a lot of churches doing this. I think it's fantastic that a lot of churches are doing it. Are stepping up to kind of help with people who are at risk of losing benefits during this government shutdown. And so if you go to murrayhills.com/give, there's a drop-down menu there that will let you choose SNAP assistance. And what that is a fund that we're going to give to food pantries. Because my thought was when people run out of the benefits and they're trying to figure out what to do, they're probably going to go to food pantries and go, hey, can you help us? As a matter of fact, Shelly texted me yesterday and said the well saw twice as many people yesterday as they normally see in a day. Amanda, I emailed with her on Friday, and she said they saw twice as many people on Friday as they normally see on a regular day. That's Harvest Share. And so we know that the food pantries are feeling an impact already. They emptied their shelves out once at the well and then restocked them on the site. And she said, we never do that. And we always restock at night after it's over. But so what we're going to do with that money that's given is we're just going to distribute it to those food pantries, local food pantries. That way it goes directly to them. The food that you brought in today, we're just going to distribute that to them as well. We'll figure out a way to get them as well. And we'll just keep doing the food drive until they figure it out. I hope they figure it out soon, but I mean, so the food drive is just open. If you want, anytime you want to stop by, our office is open, drop off some food. You can drop it directly to food pantries if you want to. We're just going to get it to those 2 food pantries. We're just making it easy for you. And the money is going to be distributed to them as well. And even if they get it worked out, which they will at some point, once they get it worked out and you're like, yeah, but they got it worked out and now it's retroactive and they're going to receive all the benefits. Listen, the food pantries always need help. You'd be amazed. The well saw 28,000 families last year. And Harvest Share saw like 9,000 to 10,000. That's how many they treated. That's how many they served last year. 28,000 between those 2 locations. So they always need help. So even if they get the SNAP stuff figured out, we're still going to help them with this. And I appreciate you guys stepping up and bringing food and donating. We've already got about $4,000 in that fund right now, so I appreciate you guys doing that. Next Sunday, Hebrews chapter 12, at least the first half of it. And we'll see you then. Have a great rest of the day.